An editor-at-large at Brooklyn's Cabinet magazine. I forgot to mention, actually, he's an assistant professor at Boston University. He's also the director of graduate studies there. He's also the editor-at-large of Brooklyn's Cabinet magazine. He's published numerous examples of art criticism in places like Art Forum, which I'm sure you are familiar with. He's written catalog essays for retrospective exhibitions of Rosemary Trockel at the Museum Ludwig in Cologne and Martin Kippenberger at the Tate Modern. Most recently, he's published the following essays in anthologies: Retreat to the Private Sphere, In-Jokes in West German Art of the 1980s, which appeared in The Black Sphinx on the comedic and modern art, and his forthcoming book, Permission to Laugh, Humor in Politics and Contemporary German Art, will be published by the University of Chicago in just a few weeks here, right, in June?
Yeah, shameless plug, if I may.
There we go, okay.
I got the first copy a couple weeks ago, so.
Perfect. So
it's
look
on a
forward.
boat. It's on a boat from Hong Kong right now.
Perfect. So we call him just as his star is rising, the ideal time. So please join me in welcoming Gregory.
Thanks a lot, Thomas, and thanks so much for the invitation and for everyone who was also involved in setting up the event. I've never been to UMass Dartmouth, so that alone is fun for me, and I'm really excited to be part of this conference. I apologize for missing some of the first two sessions. I just couldn't get out of town any earlier. It's that time in the semester, but I enjoyed the third session quite a bit. So what I'm going to do today is sort of something, I said it's a little bit selfish. I want to start testing out reading sections of the book. And there's one of the main artists I deal with, Martin Kippenberger. His work lends itself to the topic of the conference. So I'm going to be presenting his work. This will be around 45 to 50 minutes, just to let you know in advance. And I've written some transitional sections, but basically I'm going to jump from a portion of the introduction into a couple of different chapters in which I speak to Kippenberger's work and the thematization of the body and the sort of physically embodied joke. So I begin with this quote. This sort of opens the introduction. The joke does not count among the qualities that members of other nations think of when they say German. And I will go from there. Otto F. Best's assessment of Germany's reputation for humorlessness should not come as a surprise. For hundreds of years, nationals and outsiders alike have characterized the Germans as overly serious, self-involved, morbid, or incapable of mirth. In his 1993 book on the subject, Best, a United States-based German scholar of comparative literature, takes the reader through the 300-year history of the word Witz in order to trace the origins of these lingering assumptions. Initially defined under the influence of the French esprit, Witz in the late 17th century connoted Geist, or spirit, closely related to the English wit. This affiliation was contested from the beginning by the French themselves, with whom German philosophers argued for over a century regarding the potential for esprit within Germanic language and culture. By the 20th century, argues Best, Witz had lost its depth. He claims that modern Germans have the disadvantage of relying on one conception of Witz that has come to signify nothing more than light wordplay. My book challenges such a limited conception of Witz by examining the work of several artists who in 1980s West Germany simultaneously mocked and revived its historical fortunes. Werner Büttner, Isa Genskin, Georg Herold, Martin Kippenberger, Albert Oehlen, and Rosemary Trockel are part of a generation, they were all born between 1947 and 53, that prioritized wit, wordplay, and joking as effective strategies for artists working in the wake of modernism. The West German artists who emerged in the 1980s represent the third generation, following the generations of the post-war period in the 1960s, responding to a series of cultural shifts that culminated in the late 1970s with a widespread loss of faith in the avant-garde link between art and politics. For the artists of the 1980s, the weakness of Witz did not present a disadvantage. Its supposedly corrupt status was one of its attractions. The modern status of Witz as everyday joke provided the artist with lowbrow punchlines that could nevertheless hint at the term's earlier associations with highbrow culture, generating humorous, categorical, and conceptual slippages. Joking is a mode of communication that is not typically described as innovative. Run-of-the-mill jokes tend either to be up to date, preying on current political or social ills and deriding those responsible, or they fit into classic categories such as ethnic or profession-based topics. Regardless of the format, the telling of traditional jokes has long been a relatively tired narrative form, despite its resurgence during the age of the internet and email message forwarding. For German artists of the 1980s generation, joking was the perfect vehicle for the expression of cultural pessimism. According to a joke theorist, the form has suffered from a loss of the ability to edify, one of the key virtues associated with the wits of the Enlightenment. Carl Hill writes from the 18th century on, the, quote, punch of tendentious jokes often contained a far-reaching yet immediate critique of repressive social structures. This historical background is kept in sight as I explore how West German artists of the 1980s tapped into their country's long-running, if often downplayed or ignored, engagement with the comedic. Despite the term's loss of philosophical strength, the artists in question still occasionally revived wits in its classical form, even if they did so with evident irony. Their return to the tradition of wits took place at a moment in West Germany when, given dominant cultural debates about domestic terrorism and grappling with the Nazi legacies, the humor situation, a term that was used by a critic at the time, was not well established. Perhaps this explains why much of the work discussed in this study is not laugh-out-loud funny. Instead, the jokes are often subtle and indirect, as if in anticipation of an unpredictable and contentious response from the audience. Two singular works of art offer cases in point. In 1970, West German artist-activist Klaus Steck made the seemingly self-evident announcement that the 1960s had come to an end. His small sculpture, Requiescat in Ludwig, claimed as much, a mock tombstone fashioned out of a catalog published that year that contained highlights from the influential private collection of chocolate magnate Peter Ludwig. Located at the time in Cologne's Wallraf-Richards Museum, the Ludwig collection was weighted heavily toward U.S. pop art of the 1960s. In this work, Steck took aim at the West German cultural elite's desire to own contemporary American art. He affixed a metal plate engraved with the decade's dates and the Latin for rest in peace to the book's cover, partially obscuring a prototypical pop painting by Roy Lichtenstein and reinforcing a message of the historical passage. This modest object was meant to be displayed on the floor standing up, as if marking the spot where the outgoing decade had been buried for good. And on the left is the way it's correctly displayed. The right is a shot I took of it in a vitrine in a library. As a critique of the German importation of a seemingly uncritical American pop art, Steck's sculpture lamented pop's occlusion of more socially and politically progressive art of the 1960s. Several years after he produced it, Steck's piece made a significant appearance at Documenta 6 in Kassel during the summer of 1977. His initial critique of 1960s German collecting trends had new meaning as the 1970s was beginning to approach its own conclusion. Documenta 6 took place after student protests had turned into organized violence and immediately prior to the 1977 German autumn, when key members of the radical terrorist Red Army faction died under questionable circumstances at Stammheim prison. The mid-1970s had seen the social fabric of West Germany come under enormous strain, prompted by an economic downturn that had started in the oil industry in 1972 and the social crisis engendered by domestic terrorism. By 1977, as Documenta 6 curator Manfred Schneckenburger signaled with the Steck object, whatever traces of 60s optimism had lingered into the next decade could now be declared outdated. Thus it was that Steck's unimposing sculpture gained measurably in terms of its currency with a historical moment frequently characterized by pessimism. If Steck's miniature anti-monument can serve as a bookend to the early years of post-60s art in West Germany, then Martin Kippenberger's artist book, Das Ende der Avantgarde, can mark another endpoint. Produced for an exhibition at the Galerie Gisela Kapitän in Cologne in 1989, it is one among scores of books and editions that the prolific Kippenberger produced from 1977 up to his death in 1997. Typical of his work is the partially accidental nature of the final product. The misspelled title printed on the book's cover was the result of a printer's error, but Kippenberger liked how it reinforced the message of the content inside. This consisted of 6 pages printed in silkscreen with a balloon motif, an image that Kippenberger frequently employed. Within the balloons, which resemble speech bubbles and comic strips, he inserted images and text that referred to his life and work. The relevance of the great avant-garde tradition, a balloon about to implode, appears to have been compromised by Kippenberger himself. Kippenberger and a number of his contemporaries promoted a mixture of willful and fortuitous humor, bringing up questions of failure and ineffectiveness. This generation mobilized various modes of joking and self-deprecatory humor throughout the late 1970s and 1980s, launching a period that had strong ties to the 1960s, but that spoke directly to anxieties of the present moment. Steck's use of satirical humor as a means to highlight greed, corruption, and hypocrisy represented only one option among many available to artists emerging in the mid to late 1970s who sought to invest their work with socially critical subject matter. If Steck's work from the early 1960s to the present, in his work from the 1960s to the present, the politically motivated art object is designed to broadcast a clear, forceful message of critique. And on the left, you can see the translation makes it clear. The poster on the right was done in relation to the tenant solidarity movement, which was a pro-renters movement in a period of rising rents in different cities in Germany in the early 70s. He was involved with this cause. Steck himself was trained as a lawyer in the 60s, and he was very successful in a number of cases, actually bringing lawsuits and defending himself against slander and many others. This on the bottom here says a work by Albrecht Dürer, of course, is the image, and below it says, "Would you rent a room to this woman?" His position is by no means naive, but it stands in contrast to that of the subsequent generation. While numerous young artists who experienced the 1960s as children and teenagers were affected by the era's protest-oriented mentality, they came of artistic age in the late 1970s, at a political moment filled with doubt and insecurity, often perceived to be empty of the promises of the previous decade. The notion of taking a concrete, identifiable position was fraught with difficulties. These younger artists arrived on the West German scene after the groundbreaking work of neo-avant-garde groups like Fluxus and individuals like Joseph Beuys had failed, despite their best efforts, to unite art and life in a lasting way. Beuys' long-running, well-publicized attempt to promote a politically transformative social sculpture, that's the phrase he used for his work, had only achieved limited results. The sense that a historical chapter had closed led many to adopt a postmodern second-order status, thus abandoning the avant-garde's drive toward rupture and renewal. The 1980s generation of artists heralded what the cultural critic Dietrichson wryly labeled the coming of cynicism, that's his phrase, the coming of cynicism, a condition often attributed to the market-driven art world of the 1980s. It would be far too simple to claim that cynicism was the inevitable condition of artists emerging during the aftermath of the 1960s. Dietrichson's highly loaded term, one that presupposes a state of defeatism, is more provocation to discussion than an honest representation of this generation's outlook. There existed a wide spectrum along which West German artists could situate themselves in terms of political and social commitment in the aftermath of 1960s utopianism. But a number of them did make clear in their work that they no longer had much faith in art's power of direct political persuasion. Instead of promulgating a group aesthetic, it is perhaps more accurate to speak in terms of loose affiliations and shared attitudes that reflect a deep sense of skepticism rather than a withdrawal into cynicism. Throughout my book, Witz is considered as offering two distinct structures, a narrative device with a setup and punchline, or the everyday joke, as well as a more discursive conception of the term that places it closer to enlightenment wit. The difference is one of temporality. The former exhausts itself in a hurry, while the latter takes time to unfold. Together, jokes and wit provided the vehicles by which these artists could treat political and topical subject matter without losing sight of the perceived impossibility of direct action. I seek to explore the ways in which the two communicative modes afforded the artist a license to embrace ambiguity while still making critical statements. Some members, including Werner Büttner, Martin Kippenberger, and Albert Oehlen, of this generation of German artists may have gravitated toward the standard short-lived joke, but others, such as Isa Genskin, Georg Herold, and Rosemarie Trockel, developed a more philosophical wit that called for contemplation. I mean, chapters separate these two groups of artists in order to pursue the two distinct models of Witz. So just to explain the work on the left, Herold has two traits of laugh, wooden laugh, and Goethe, as you can see, the great scholar of classical German. Culture is written on the one, and in the bottom is Im Vergleich dazu irgendein Scheißer, which politely put means something like in comparison to him, some loser or some pathetic individual. And then this is Zygenskin's My Brain, which is brain size with, and you don't see it here, but it's covered in her fingerprints. So it's a sort of molding of her own brain with an antenna sticking out of it. To understand the skeptical political outlook of this period, one must recall that 30 years ago, crisis mode had set in among members of the political left in West Germany. By the mid-1970s, various theories attempted to explain a shift in the political, social, and/or cultural climate, many of them collected under the rubric of an alleged Tendenzwende. Translated as a change of direction, or more loosely as a cultural turn, the term began circulating within the mass media around 1973 in the wake of the decade's first oil crisis, and with increased frequency as Helmut Schmidt took over from Willy Brandt as chancellor in 1974. There are two dominant meanings of the concept for the 1970s. On the one hand, a rise in neoconservatism in response to the late 1960s student revolt. On the other, a wider transformation in consciousness away from public concerns and toward private matters, or the so-called new subjectivity that found expression in contemporary West German literature and visual arts. Jost Hermann has described the resulting climate as a, quote, feeling of helplessness, a lack of orientation, a new sense of powerlessness, indeed a hangover. This uncertain period also saw the publication of Peter Berger's theory of the avant-garde, which was published in its original form in 1974, translated 10 years later. A widely read and influential analysis of the historical avant-garde that made its own contribution to 1970s political pessimism. For Berger, artists of the 1960s lacked direction after the avant-garde's institutionalization had weakened progressive cultural practice. Disruptive modern movements like Dada and Surrealism lost their bite as galleries and museums historicized their output during the post-war period. Despite widespread agreement with Berger that the avant-garde had run its course, subsequent writers have taken him to task for misdiagnosing the situation of what he called the post-avant-garde. Jochen Schulte-Sasse, for instance, described Berger as being mired in the same cultural pessimism that had characterized Theodor W. Adorno's negative assessment of art's viability as a socially relevant agent. Adorno's support of art's autonomy and separation from everyday life, or the social totality, as he called it, led him to promote the idea that art is, in Schulte-Sasse's words, the medium of hibernation in bad times. So Schulte-Sasse used this phrase to describe Adorno, his promotion of art's autonomy as the medium of hibernation in bad times. Berger was similarly burdened by his negative views on art's powers of social persuasion, and his book contained no prescription for an art of the future that might take up where the historical avant-garde left off in seeking to reconcile art and life. The mid-1970s atmosphere of political stagnation was linked to a profound feeling of disillusionment on both sides of the political spectrum. A string of books and essays appeared on the subject in the late 1970s and early 1980s, written by left-leaning scholars as well as individuals who identified themselves as neoconservatives. The Tendenzwende was viewed alternately as a dangerous drift to the right and as a possibility for addressing grievances associated with the radicalism of the 1960s. Most of all, it was associated with a widespread sense of disappointment, whether one regretted the supposed failures of the student protest movement or was frustrated by the influence of the political left during the 1960s. Tracking the rise in neoconservative thinking during the 1970s, Jürgen Habermas singled out disappointment as the primary motivation for many political writers in West Germany and the United States. In a 1977 issue of Kursbuch, a very important left-wing political journal that was founded in the 60s, Johann August Schulein attempted to explain from a socio-psychological perspective how the Tendenzwende had led many of the individuals in the protest movements to direct their attention toward improving their personal lives outside of the public political arena. Labeling this development the Rückzug ins Private, or the retreat to the private, Schulein attempted to identify typical problems and responses that had cropped up since the early 1970s as protests turned into rigid dogmatism. This led him to remind his readers that self-critique was also indispensable for the process of critiquing society. Quote, "The identity that a subject requires in order to become politically oppositional under the conditions of the Tendenzwende must be fundamentally self-reflexive. Critical fantasy alone is no longer enough." For Schulein, the attention devoted to the problems of the Alltag, or everyday, was not entirely negative. Rather, the return to the private represented a, quote, historically necessary concentration on everyday problems that until now hindered and distorted political praxis. The late 1970s crisis mode called for a regrouping, a period in which to seek new strategies that would account for the failings and omissions of the previous decade. This cursory discussion of the state of cultural politics in West Germany of the late 1970s is intended to establish the socio-political backdrop against which artists born around 1950 had to situate themselves and their artistic practices. It is not to overlook the fact that there were still those from the left who held out hope for the effectiveness of what was called at the time the new social movements, including the anti-nuclear, women's, gay rights, and environmental movements, which distanced themselves from the student movement. Clearly, positive transformations had been enacted as a result of the anti-authoritarian movement, and they would continue to take place throughout the 1970s and 1980s in a shifting constellation of causes. But this does not take away from the fact that the mood dominant among the left, including in the realm of cultural production, was fairly grim. The question remained as to whether artists were to give in to the sense of disappointment that sparked neoconservatism. As a sign that artists were in tune with the political uncertainties of the time, their Witz-oriented work of the 1980s often spoke to an awareness of compromise. Like disappointment, compromise was part of the discourse of intellectuals working after the Tendenzwende. Habermas saw compromise as a defining feature of the developing neoconservatism, as well as something that had to be confronted by left-leaning intellectuals and cultural producers. The danger for artists who would too quickly settle for a position of compromise is that their works could be interpreted as strictly affirmative of the status quo. Such an interpretation, however, falls into the trap of working solely in simplistic binary oppositions between left and right, progressive and reactionary, action and inaction. Jokes and wit opened up slippages between critical commentary and passive indecision. The 1980s generation, perhaps more so than the post-war generation, and the one that came of age in the 1960s, was conditioned by contemporary politics to find a place in between the extremes. What would compromise in the realm of cultural politics mean for artists in the early stages of their careers? In the midst of the early 1980s phase of political withdrawal, a book appeared in West Germany that served to capture for many the mood of the period and in its own way offer a corrective. The philosopher Peter Sloterdijk's Critique of Cynical Reason, first published in West Germany in 2 volumes in 1983, met with astounding, commercial success for a work of cultural history and philosophy. Yet Sloterdijk did not compromise at setting himself an ambitious set of goals. A brief history of the concept of cynicism, an analysis of the failures of the Enlightenment, and an attempt to reconstitute a critical and self-reflexive subjectivity for the present. In his assessment of the dangers that accompanied the rationalist enterprise of the Enlightenment, Sloterdijk was informed by the work of the Frankfurt School, especially Max Horkheimer and Adorno's Dialectic of Enlightenment of 1944. However, Sloterdijk was not simply trying to put forward new or at least revised notions of truth in order to revive the Enlightenment project. As Andreas Huysen points out in his foreword to the Critique of Cynical Reason, as it is published in English in 1987, quote, Sloterdijk's position remains crucially ambivalent in that he has as much trouble with the truth in quotation marks, of critical theory, as with the total dissolution of truth, reason, and subjectivity in certain radical forms of post-structuralism, end quote. It is this very ambivalence that gives the book its intellectual charge and makes it relevant to many questions being posed in the art world in the same period. The position of ambivalence, so central to theories of the postmodern, is not always or necessarily the result of an unwelcome inability to decide on one particular set of options or the other. Willful ambivalence can reflect a coming to terms with reality, a perhaps only temporary reassessment of a given situation. According to Sloterdijk, cynicism itself has been unfairly maligned as simply representing the world-weary, opportunistic attitude that it describes in common speech. He explains that among the cynics of ancient Greece, it actually originated as a philosophy of resistance to restrictive social norms, instead promoting the value of self-control and individual liberation. It is the figures of Diogenes of Sinope of the 4th century BC that Sloterdijk locates as model cynic, or Cynic is the term he uses, spelled K-Y-N-I-C, to distinguish ancient cynicism from its modern variation. Diogenes took these ideas regarding morality to their most extreme form. Legend has it that this led Diogenes to live in a barrel and beg for his food, as well as to behave outrageously in public in order to flout social customs. In other words, the cynic has affinities with the traditional image of the avant-garde artist as a renegade and breaker of taboos. Diogenes represents for Sloterdijk the ideal emancipated individual who should be emulated, though perhaps not in a literal sense, in what the latter perceived as the prevalent climate of passivity and resignation after the political projects of the late 1960s and 1970s had faltered. For West German artists of the 1980s generation, the option as laid out by Sloterdijk was to either give in to cynicism and false consciousness, or take the prevailing skepticism and employ it to constructive ends. Strategies of joking could lead in either direction, but also allow one to oscillate between them. An analysis of their public appearances, works of art, and critical reception will demonstrate that the artists often occupied both positions at the same time. Sloterdijk framed the dilemma as the choice between escapism and collaboration. Quote, "Escapists are justified because they do not want to be entangled with open eyes in the intolerable cynicisms of a society in which the distinction between producing and destroying is becoming blurred. Collaboration is justified because individuals are also permitted to orient themselves towards survival in the short run." End quote. In the aftermath of the Tendenzwende, young West German artists clarified that the line between affirmation and critique was often impossible to distinguish. Now I'll move back to talking a bit more about artworks, sort of some of the theoretical background to the later chapter. So given the focus in today's conference on the body, I want to now highlight the physical comedy in the work of Martin Kippenberger. Kippenberger was the member of this generation most active in constructing a public presence. In an essay for one of the many retrospective exhibitions that followed his untimely death in 1997 at the age of 44, Dietrich Dietrichson, I mentioned earlier, employed the term Selbstdarsteller, you see on the screen, to describe, quote, the relationship of performance and an empty, or at best, delegating command center. If one wanted to find a form of working and producing that could be understood and bear fruit within the artwork, end quote. A literal English translation of the word would lead to self-portrayer. Perhaps the closest equivalent would be self-promoter, but this does not fully convey the overtly performative nature of the term Selbstdarsteller. The word Darsteller means actor in German, so that a Selbstdarsteller acts out the role of him or herself. The label is used commonly in Germany to describe public figures of all stripes, especially politicians and popular entertainers. However, Dietrichson identified Kippenberger as the first individual to whom the term was applied on a consistent basis, beginning already in the late 1970s. Kippenberger was enrolled in the class of Rudolf Hausner at the Art Academy in Hamburg beginning in 1972, though by all accounts he was not a particularly serious student. He never completed his degree in Hamburg, breaking off his studies in 1976, the same year in which his mother's death led to a substantial inheritance, and that inheritance kept him funded for many large-scale projects through the late 1970s and into the early 1980s. In December of 1976, Kippenberger moved to Florence, where he lived during the next several months while producing his first complete set of paintings, One of You, a German in Florence. The Italian language title, the original title is written in Italian, Uno di voi, un tedesco firenze. It is his first work that resulted from sustained reflection on what it meant to fully immerse himself within an untested place and culture. The series originally consisted of up to 83 canvases. The exact number of extant works is unclear. Some were discarded and others made their way singly into private collections. Each measuring 50 by 60 centimeters, painted in black and white and encompassing a variety of images related to his new environment. Postcards, newspaper clippings, album covers, and his own snapshots. Black and white was selected as the palette since he had no experience at mixing oil paints, and he set himself the task of producing 2 pictures per day. A likely source for the series is the typical Italian restaurant, or certainly its West German interpretation. And during the 1970s, West Germany saw the growth of these really popular Italian restaurants in West Germany specifically. reinforcing the plebeian view of the typical Italian restaurant with the salon-style hanging portraits of movie stars and other notables. And you're looking at it here at the Paris Bar in Berlin, a bar owned by a good friend of Kippenberger, the collector and artist Michel Rödler, who carried out a deal with Kippenberger where he would leave it hanging on the walls of the restaurant for free meals as long as he wanted. And so this was up there for many, many years. The idea was to produce enough single canvases so that when stacked, they would reach Kippenberger's height of 1.89 meters. True to form, he intentionally gave up the project 10 centimeters short of its target. Kippenberger spent his most professionally formative years in the politically charged atmosphere of West Berlin in the late 1970s, where he, Bruckner, and Erlen first came into contact with each other. His work in this period must be considered in light of the newly emerging countercultural movements of punk rock and new wave, which he had a direct exposure to through the bands that played in SO36. And here's a later view of the facade of SO36 in the neighborhood of Kreuzberg. It's still there and still active to this day. The club in an abandoned Kreuzberg supermarket that he co-managed after its opening in 1978. And this is him playing in his own band, Luxus, in late 78, early 1979. But he booked many bands, including Iggy Pop, Wire, Devo, Adam and the Ants, who was very much invested in the punk and new wave scene at the time. The arrival of punk at the same moment in which direct political action had lost its appeal opened up a great deal of maneuvering room for an artist-organizer like Kippenberger. As Christoph Banach, a chronicler of the events in SO36, wrote, quote, "Punk was a gesture in slogans, which also meant, think today, done tomorrow," end quote. Kippenberger thrived in an environment where he could exercise his talents for the speedy realization of ideas and for bringing together diverse strands of widely dispersed music, literature, and art scenes. In 1978, together with his future Cologne art dealer Gisela Kapitän, he founded Kippenberger's Büro, or Kippenberger's office, located at a short remove from SO36. Between the two venues, Kippenberger was able to establish himself as a successful promoter of people and ideas, orchestrating an ongoing series of informal exhibitions and events that placed equal importance on showing the work of artists and constructing a social context. The poster Kippenberger designed in 1978 summarized his position as Master of Ceremonies and General Cultural Attaché. Titled Kippenberger's Office used the entire palette of our services, he listed mediation, consultation, and pictures, you see in the 3 words and bullet points there, as 3 of his primary offerings for the prospective client. The crude image of a painter's palette with brushes sticking through it partially obscures banknotes, coins, and deposit slips, symbols of professional success only superficially in conflict with the anti-commercial attitude of punk-dominated Kreuzberg in the late 1970s. SO36 lasted in its first phase for a little under a year, after which it initially closed down in June of 1979. Like the district in which it was located, SO36 had been a volatile place from the beginning as competing subcultures, punks, rockers, bikers, attempted to shape the neighborhood to their liking. Only months after SO36 shut its doors, Kippenberger was savagely beaten and hospitalized by young former patrons, allegedly complaining of the high prices once charged at the club. There are numerous accounts of the 1980 assault and the motivation of his attackers, but there is no doubt that the artist quickly realized that it could be used as fodder for his work. A Polaroid photograph taken of Kippenberger at the hospital where he was recovering from severe head injuries is painful to look at. From behind bloody bandages and gauze, Kippenberger stares back at the viewer through swollen eyes, his head wrapped in a cotton dressing. This picture turned up the following year in an invitation card for a 1981 exhibition in Stuttgart at Gallery Achim Kubinski, entitled Dialogue with the Youth, or Dialog mit der Jugend. By then, Kippenberger was 28 years old and had already made the transition from youth to adulthood, especially in the eyes of the teen-oriented punk scene. Clearly, his tenure as club promoter and art consultant did not signal someone merely suffering from youthful indecision or inexperience. He may have retained the spontaneous energy of adolescence, but the punks recognized in Kippenberger a figure of authority that inspired their active resistance. Kippenberger became known early on for mining his own adventurous daily existence in the constant search for new material that might lend itself to single works and exhibition-related ephemera. The most notorious reworking of the Dialog photograph is his 1982 self-portrait. The painting brings his damaged visage to the front of the picture plane, Floating in the air are cocktail and beer glasses, musical notes, bright spots of paint, and other indicators of a life of excess. In a few key places, Kippenberger has thickly applied putty directly onto the surface of the canvas to give the image a kind of scab-like texture that makes it all the more tangible and repulsive in the manner of a Francis Bacon painting. A rather perverse kind of Selbstdarstellung that neatly captures the character of a great deal of Kippenberger's work, confrontational, dramatic, humorous, and pathetic. Like a good stand-up comic, Kippenberger knew how to take advantage of a seemingly desperate situation and turn it into productive material. Youth in Kippenberger's formulation is as much about his own aging process as it is about any potential conversation with a new generation biting at his heels. The self-portrait represents a taking leave of his own formative years, since he painted it a year after his first solo show with Max Hetzler in Stuttgart, when more widespread public recognition began to develop. The action behind the image, in this case the receiving of a beating, came about indirectly, that is, not through the artist's specific intentions or planning, though one could probably argue against that, just given the way he continually alienated and provoked his audience at the time. By the same token, Kippenberger deliberately inserted himself into the Kreuzberg context, in which spontaneous violence was part of the daily program. The emphasis on direct lived experience in this period is supported by the built-in authenticity of the street, even if Kippenberger only used it as just one more site for the production of a damaged artistic subjectivity. Discussing the role of shame in the history of human self-consciousness, Sloterdijk's words are well suited to describe Kippenberger's own portrayal of ironic self-martyrdom. Quote, "Those who never wanted to sink below the earth's surface are lacking one of the essential experiences of subjectivity." End quote. That's from a later book, from the early 90s. Kippenberger's recasting of his life's mishaps into moments of stubborn glory suggests that the question of artistic success in the 1980s was not as straightforward as the general hype around the decade's rampant careerism might seem to indicate. Artists from Kippenberger's generation, who were obviously far from shy when it came to self-promotion, were at the same time critical of the art industry and all of its trappings. Part of the emphasis they placed on the testing out of ideas and methods was directed toward allowing room for false decisions and bad planning. It would be an overstatement to say that they strategically worked toward failure, an impossible task by definition. One cannot intend to fail successfully. Yet they seized on blunders, building them into their practice as one highly productive source for new ideas and topics. This active cultivation of a type of failure takes the artist one step beyond Joseph Beuys's awareness of the impossibility of his neo-avant-garde mission. Recalling the activity of Kippenberger's office, the younger artist later spoke proudly of the title of a review he once received in the Berliner Zeitung, a Berlin daily paper, quote, "Kippenberger, das Besondere Nichts," or Kippenberger, the exceptional nothing. He claimed, quote, "Such a headline, for that I worked for a long time. I was happy about it." Success was not forsaken altogether, yet its terms had been altered in an age when traditional conceptions of professionalism were viewed with great skepticism. In several projects, especially in the second half of the 1980s, Kippenberger employed performative strategies in order to expose the cliché at the heart of many images of the successful and productive modern artist, as well as to offer his own countermodel of the fecund, grotesque body. Historically, the rational, productive body is represented by the self-contained entity that Leonardo da Vinci depicted in the late 15th century as the geometrically inscribed Vitruvian man. The Vitruvian man's antithesis is the grotesque body, which is full of holes and exposed to the world. Leonardo's near contemporary, Rabelais, looked back to the late Middle Ages for a depiction of the body that is porous and in danger of fragmentation. As Mikhail Bakhtin put it, quote, "The artistic logic of the grotesque image ignores the closed, smooth, and impenetrable surface of the body and retains only its excrescences, sprouts, buds, and orifices, only that which leads beyond the body's limited space or into the body's depths." End quote. Writing in the early 1980s, Sloterdijk suggested that the contemporary drive to comprehend our closeness to and dependence on the physical world is part of what he called the psychosomatics of the zeitgeist. Revealing the body's fragility, notably that of his own figure, Kippenberger produced numerous self-portraits throughout his career that appear to confirm Sloterdijk's theory. In the spirit of the times, Kippenberger consistently treated his own figure as a physically penetrable entity that contributed to his project of Selbstdarstellung. The German literary theorist Hans Robert Jauss writes the following about what he terms the comic hero, that's his term. Quote, invested with the positive quality of the affirmation of the pleasure principle, the grotesque hero who triumphs over his fear can do his part to make the unofficial truth of laughter prevail, and thus create a laughing rapport with his public. End quote. The laughter that Kippenberger inspired was not solely derisive. His success was due partly to the fact that he mocked tradition while upholding many of its values. As a West German artist, Kippenberger was able to exploit and comment on the long tradition of self-portraiture within German art from Albrecht Dürer to the present. At the same time, he drew on numerous precursors from the history of modern art. Kippenberger had an eye for stylistic idiosyncrasy, which he could respond to in the form of parody, as well as blatant emulation. One of the key elements in Kippenberger's questioning of standards involved the notion of creativity itself. If great artists of the past have often been singled out partly due to their abundant output and fertile imagination, Kippenberger's project was simultaneously to rival and lampoon these qualities. Many of his satirical projects took aim at the piousness and self-importance with which modern artists have been promoted and received. Kippenberger often used the public persona of Pablo Picasso as a foil for his commentary on artistic genius. Kippenberger concentrated specifically on the Picasso of the post-war period, post-World War II that is, when the latter had already been lionized for decades and was spending time on the Riviera. However, Kippenberger was not interested in Picasso as an individual, rather it was the image of the aging but still macho member of the avant-garde projected by the art world and the media that captivated Kippenberger, who could merge with a recognizable figure from the past in order to highlight the shortcomings of the present. Beginning in 1985 with an exhibition invitation card, Kippenberger made repeated use of a famous photograph of Picasso wearing a tight bathing suit that flaunts both his protruding stomach and the outline of his genitals. Kippenberger latched onto this image with its clear display of the primary sites of consumption and procreation as the perfect signifier of artistic fecundity. At the same time, Kippenberger had begun to develop his own sizable belly through years of heavy drinking. He was thus able to cast himself in two series of paintings from 1988 and 1992 in the role of the failed Picasso, the painter who possessed the appropriate virility and manhood, but who nevertheless produced hackneyed works full of overwrought symbolism. Many of these paintings heighten the grotesque nature of the artist's body through Kippenberger's distortion of the hands and arms to make them appear more ineffective. An untitled oil on canvas of 1992 portrays a rotund figure with claw-like appendages whose level of productivity can only be compromised by his clumsy, unheroic features. The emphasis on the tensed and twisted fingers of the artist recalls Joseph Leo Kerner's discussion of Dürer's central placement of his rather awkwardly rendered hand in the famous self-portrait of 1500. Kippenberger could depict the overwrought, feeble-looking body of the male artist in his self-portraits as a mean towards exploring the traditional link between masculinity and authenticity. In doing so, he relied on a long-established tradition of uncertain representations of the male body that emerged under Romanticism and culminated in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. In the German-speaking realm, the most relevant example is the work of Lovis Corinth, another hard-living German artist active a century before Kippenberger. As Kippenberger mentioned in a late interview, Corinth was among the artists whose prints covered the walls of the family home. Kippenberger's father was a kind of amateur artist himself and had a lot of works of art and reproductions of art in the family home. Corinth's numerous self-portraits, some of which allude to a life of decadence, project self-mockery as well as a suffering and mortal body. He clearly had a sense of humor and was able to laugh at himself, but he did not fully relinquish the role of artist as hero-martyr that emerged during the 19th century, particularly in France, in the work of Courbet, Van Gogh, Gauguin, and others. Like Corinth, Kippenberger straddled the line between self-deprecation and self-glorification, though in a climate of postmodern skepticism, he placed far more emphasis on the former. Kippenberger's anti-idealizing presentation of the body also looks back to the tradition of utilizing the overfed or flabby belly for satirical and political purposes. This is particularly true of the Weimar period in Germany, as artists like Hannah Höch altered already unflattering images of politicians to further undercut their authority. Höch's 1919 photomontage, Dada Rundschau, or Dada Review, It's based on a photograph of President Friedrich Ebert and Reichswehrminister Gustav Noske that was essentially already a joke from the beginning. This is what one art historian has identified. Pictured wading in a lake in their bathing suits, the officials' midsections are adorned with flowers to drive home the message of compromised virility. As Bridget Doherty has explained, a swollen stomach is often referenced in Germany after World War I in order to ridicule the newly formed government. Quote, left-wing caricaturists consistently opted for that mocking embodiment to tell the story of undignified middle-class rule, believing and wanting to show that there was something new, something especially petty and grotesque about the Weimar Republic's body politic. End quote. Perhaps the equivalent of state power in the art world might be the reverence with which artists like Picasso have been treated during their lifetime. Kippenberger evidently saw in Picasso the embodiment of the artist as a larger-than-life figure, his body scarcely able to contain the creative ferment that wells up from within. As the younger artist took on similar proportions with age, he was able to align himself with a history that he could engage through the vehicles of both parody and sympathetic imitation. In Kippenberger's work, the grotesque belly was not merely understood as an object of scorn. It held positive significance as an emblem of productivity. Unlike some writers on the political left in early 1980s West Germany, Kippenberger welcomed the turn to gross corporeality that was implied in the abandonment of theoretical discourse in the wake of the 1977 German Autumn. Tilman Spengler, co-editor of Kursbuch, wrote an article in 1981 bemoaning the ideological uncertainties that accompany what, following his lead, we might call an avant-garde of the belly. Spengler's essay, whose title translates into The Belly as Avant-Garde, on the upright downfall of theory, that's the title, argued that the 1960s emphasis on theory had been replaced by instinct and an almost obsessive concern with the body below the neck. He wrote, quote, though the belly has predictable passions, what will now become the object of desire, what the rumbling concretely signals, must remain a surprise. Spengler's observations are indicative of the Tendenzwende, of widespread worries that reasoned theory was being replaced by gut reactions. Kippenberger benefited from the newfound interest in people's lower passions as the belly afforded a plurality of symbolic options. This metaphor could be extended to encompass several other forms that he frequently made reference to that were directly or indirectly associated with fertility. For example, eggs, both raw and cooked, life preservers, and breasts. Kippenberger delighted in finding intriguing correspondences between base matter and human physicality. In 1988, he produced an abject pin-up calendar, Elite 88, that contained numerous views of him posing in a pair of white standard issue men's briefs. For the July scene, the artist is depicted standing in front of a mirror with his hands clasped behind his back, gazing admiringly at the girth of his beer belly. He had already thematized his penchant for addiction and reckless behavior in a 1981 oil on canvas entitled Alcohol Torture. With a frightened look on his face, here he holds up his hands, which are caught in two plastic rings on either side of a beer can suspended from the same three-pack holder. And this, like many of his works, this take more explanation in each case. There's a very specific local reference there. In Dusseldorf, Schlosser Alt was a beer that came out with what I think was known as the only three-pack. So he didn't have to actually snip a six-pack. This was a kind of ready-made that he employed. In a move that was typical for his practice in general, he incorporated the beer can handcuffs into various later works, using them for a magazine cover illustration in 1984, and turning the sculptural object itself into a multiple in 1989. Once he latched onto a form of source material, whether self-produced or appropriated from mass-circulated imagery, Kippenberger ingested and repeatedly processed it until he exhausted its use value. In addition, this work demonstrates how Kippenberger's Selbstdarstellung made physical the notion of discursive stupidity. It's a term I discuss elsewhere in the book, and it's a term used by theorists of performance art. He calls it diskursive Dummheit. This was a book written in the late 1980s. I've been translating that as discursive stupidity, and it plays a role in some of my chapters. Also, as Avital Ronell, writing on the literary history of stupidity, states, quote, though the question of its essence consistently provokes response, stupidity is basically a matter of Darstellung, of presentation, which is to say, of that which shows itself as being stupid, end quote. Kippenberger thrived on such self-debasing display, providing a physical counterpart to his verbal and visual jokes. Kippenberger's body alters its proportion from image to image, acting out Bakhtin's description of an aspect of the grotesque. Bakhtin wrote that the grotesque body is, quote, a body in the act of becoming. It is never finished, never completed. It is continually built, created, and builds and creates another body, end quote. However, like many artists who parody tradition, Kippenberger's method of positioning himself in reference to cliché-ridden conceptions of the artist betray a level of respect for the object of his criticism. The desire to dismantle the image of the heroic creator does not, of course, indicate an outright rejection of this role in society. Yet if failure does find its way into an analysis of Kippenberger's work, to what extent did he actually conceive of it as part of his artistic practice? There is an undercurrent of the pathetic running throughout his career, as he fashioned himself into a kind of anti-hero. What is crucial in Kippenberger's work is that he literally embodied the condition of failure. It could be seen in the images and objects he produced, but it relied on the visibility of his own physical presence. At the same time, through the comedic centralization of his own body, Kippenberger attempted to rescue some of the missing authenticity in the late 1970s and 1980s. Thanks. Yep.
You talking about Kippenberger as an anti-hero and as the embodiment of failure. How does that link, or is that in opposition to, say, neo-expressionism, and I'm thinking of Baselitz and Luppertz and
yeah.
the Italian avant-garde with Achille Bonito Oliva,
right.
with Cucchi, Clementi, and Chia.
Yeah.
So do you see this as an opposition to the authenticity of neo-expressionist painters during the period?
That's a great question. And I deal with that in another chapter. So the way, well, there's two sort of main things to say about that. One is that the histories that have developed in the last 20 years or so of neo-expressionism, which is a term that itself emerges in the early 1980s, early to mid-80s, and it was a contentious term from the beginning. Most of the artists who were labeled as neo-expressionists didn't like the label. The histories have tended to lump a large group of artists together. And so the Transavanguardia, the artists associated with that group, and then various strands of German neo-expressionism, quote unquote, were shown together already in the early 1980s, and then again later on in ways that often created kind of false connections. So in Germany, there's sort of four things, there are four strands in the West German context. The first one is the group, like Luppertz and Baselitz, the generation that itself emerged in the 1960s. They're the generation before Kippenberger, and they're the generations that lived through the political changes of the 60s. And they were some of the first to really directly thematize the Nazi past, the Holocaust, themes that really had not been addressed in a very public way, certainly not within the visual arts up until they began to make them more public in the 60s. They were received in the early 80s when they first started showing in a serious way internationally as being on the same plane as people like Kippenberger and other younger artists. And so that was sort of already one false connection that was made, and not acknowledging the fact that there was this prehistory to neo-expressionism and post-war German painting. But the three groups of the generation that Kippenberger belongs to, two of them fit better into what people mean when they say neo-expression, which is a reinvigoration of painting with notions of authenticity. You know, the idea of a true expression of subjectivity, some kind of, one's internal state, one's psychic state, emotion, these kinds of things that are associated with historical expressionism. Those two groups are the one in West Berlin, known as it's the artist associated with the gallery on Moritzplatz in Kreuzberg. And Kippenberger knew these people, but it was a whole separate group, and it was artists who founded a space, and whose work tended, even if it was punk and had irony and parody in it, it tended to support this reading of being more authentic on some level. This kind of grittiness of the street was less put into question marks, let's say, or quotation marks. And then the other group was the Mülheimer Freiheit, which was the group based in Cologne. which likewise often was described as a bit more oriented toward authenticity, though even that's a bit debatable. The third group is Kippenberger, Erlen, and Büttner, who were somewhat falsely associated with Hamburg, partly because they studied there. Erlen was a student of Sigmar Polke at the academy there, and they emerged there. What people have begun to do, and I'm doing also in my book, is separating the Hamburg artists out from these better known, actually, so-called neo-expressionists, and explaining that a lot of what he was doing, what Erlen was doing, was critiquing the work. I mean, there are many works they produced that mock Anselm Kiefer, for instance. They did, Kippenberger and Erlen did a series in collaboration where they used oats, like basic Haferschleim, which is basically porridge, and they would sort of spear it across the surface and mix it with paint as an acknowledgement of, as a kind of mockery of Kiefer's use of unorthodox materials. And so they were separating themselves, but it would be, I think, going too far to say that they totally detached themselves from it. There's moments in their work where, as I'm saying, authenticity does reappear, but it always does through the forms of humor and joking. I mean, there's more to say there, but I think
The thing is that Kippenberger, in this country anyway, but also in Europe and in Australia, was often shown alongside all those other artists, and so we just saw German post-war art, and Kiefer was the one exception, as the kind of, at least I'm thinking of exhibitions at Marion Goodman, and then later on, recently Gagosian. Kiefer is the one who emerges as being a kind of heroic figure in opposition to this kind of anti-heroic punk, the kind of dark side. Is that accurate to see that as
well, I think
opposition?
it's not just Kiefer, it's Richter, especially right now, but already in 2003.
What about back then?
Well, back then, so it's essentially in the early 80s, there were a series of solo shows that traveled of Richter, Kiefer, and Baselis in particular. Others showed as well. Lubatz, his work traveled. Kippenberger and Erlen didn't show in the States until, I think, 86, 87. They showed a few years later. There was a delay. Their work was, and they were only having their first solo shows in West Germany in around 1981 and on. And they became well known in Germany by about 1985 or so. And so there was a kind of first wave, and there was that show Expressions that took place at the St. Louis Art Museum in the early 80s, where Donald Cuspit famously wrote the text that defended the West German painters against the attack that had been leveled the previous 2 years prior by Benjamin Buchloh, which was, it was the, just this loggerheads approach. And in a way, what I'm trying to do in my book is get away from that binary that simply sees the artist as either wallowing in a kind of unresolved mourning or wallowing in melancholy, which is essentially Buchloh's interpretation, or seeing the work as deeply cathartic, as effectively cathartic and moving into mourning and sort of moving past the trauma of the past, which was Cuspit's position. Though Cuspit later changed that in the early 90s.
That's criticism. That's criticism where you have the kind of October group and Buchloh, and that was one stream, and they really became dominant in the kind of intellectual realm. And Cuspit, and then Don Cameron and other people who were writing and who defended Expressionism kind of fell away. Is that true?
Well, I think what happened is Buchloh's, a few really key essays have dominated the discourse on West German art for some time. That's changed, it's begun to change, especially in the last 10 years.
The graduate students,
they're graduate students, It was also his attack on Beuys, when Beuys' retrospective took place at the Guggenheim in 1979. Buchloh wrote his famous Twilight of the Idols, which essentially said Beuys was a dangerous figure because he was reviving the idea of the artist as a kind of mystic, which resonated for Buchloh with fascism. And then Cuspit's position, I think it was a strong response, and a number of people, well, including somebody who now is doing some of the new work, Christine Mehring, who was at the University of Chicago. She studied with Cuspit initially, and then later went on and studied with other people for a PhD. But I think there's just much more subtlety and more nuance in the development of these histories that have been happening in the last 10 years. Now Robert Storr has become very well known for writing about Richter's work. There are another number of different angles. But that was a moment that, well, it's Buchla was able to shape the discourse in such a strong way. He also came out later and at a conference on boys in, I'm blanking on the date, it was probably in the late 90s, early 2000s, responded to his piece, essentially supported most of what he had said before, but softened it a bit and acknowledged, yes, I was writing this piece from a position of anger, so to speak, and I really took this very strong position. And one needs to understand that Buchla himself was formed politically in the late 60s in West Berlin first, and then in Dusseldorf, and he was very much involved with left-wing politics himself. So this was, I think, a strong personal response.
So you don't consider him a neo-expressionist? Is that what you're saying?
I don't. No, I really don't, because I think, for one thing, the work I'm showing you is a phase in a way, and he wanted to see himself as a painter, but he never was a painter in the way that Erland and Büttner were and always have been painters, and took their engagement with painting and its history, its historicity, very seriously. And in fact, especially with Erland in the late 80s, he began to shift toward a more serious, quote unquote, kind of painting where a lot of the joking was downplayed. And they're still in there, but they're painting now. I mean, he just had a show up at Gagosian and Madison Avenue that it's playful, it's collage driven, it's using found media imagery, and it's got these wonderful little visual jokes, but they're really subtle. And you kind of have to know his history to get them. But they're also really serious paintings. Kippenberger could really not be said to have been a serious technical painter, and by around 87 he's continued to paint as I've shown you, but he also started working in installation. He made films early on. He worked in multiples editions and sculpture, and his work really changed in terms of its materiality over time.
Do you see a contradiction between his notorious sort of hedonist and this larger-than-life persona, which he didn't really seem to be interested in concealing? I mean, is that just the punk rock influence? Because it seems almost like a contradiction in his view of the artist, because it's almost sort of a rehashing of that cliche romantic, suffering, autonomous individual. So, do you see any sort of logic behind this, or is it just a contradiction?
I think his work is kind of an enactment of contradiction. It's a representation of contradiction, and this is where these terms I'm playing with, compromise, ambivalence, and there's other ones I use in different chapters to sort of, and all of them coming out of the literature for the time. But I think he's really representative of this period. But yes, he was deeply contradictory. He was attacking these things at the same time that he wanted to live them out. And his last series before he died of cancer was a series where he had himself photographed by his wife at the time, who he married right before he died. It was his relationship late in life, a professional photographer, Elfie Semotan, a Viennese photographer, who photographed him in the poses of the figures of the Raft of the Medusa, these suffering. And it was his body. He was wearing sort of black shorts and bare upper body. And, it really didn't look ironic anymore. It was really quite, there was elements of the pathetic, but it was also deep pathos in this series. And I think as he made it, people have written about it because it came really close to, it was first shown very close to the time he contracted liver cancer, not surprisingly. And but his decline apparently was very rapid. He died within about 3 or 4 months of his diagnosis. And so people have said he didn't know he was ill when he made the series, but it looks like he might have. In other words, the series has that degree of kind of self-pathos.
And I also wonder about the punk rock influence in terms of, that self-mutilation is such a big deal in punk rock, and the idea of authenticity. There's so many sort of mythologizing forces around punk rock performers, and the photograph of Iggy Pop and the Stooges. Every performance, everyone just sort of wait for him to cut himself, and to wait for the blood to come, and then he'd jump in. It was this sort of sacrificial language. Sid Vicious doing the same thing, bloodying himself to a pulp in every performance. And you know, coming out of that context and then displaying himself, and is it a kind of identification or?
But it's again two-sided. It's that, and it is a kind of genuine sense of, you know, the authenticity of cutting into the body, acting out the kinds of things that he was watching these people do. And yet, one of the reasons these punks attacked him was because he was famous at the time for walking around in very conservative clothing. He would wear these Bavarian, these Tyrolean hats. He would wear thin ties. He basically made himself look like a member of the petty bourgeois. He looked like what they would have called a Spießer, a kind of member of the middle, the very middle class. And he stood out. He was older too. You know, he was in his late 20s by then, which for the scene I think was oldish. He was just, so he would do it, I think, in a genuine way, and yet provoke the provocateurs. I mean, that was, I think, what he was also doing. He's saying, yes, you're punk, I appreciate that, I'm punk too, and now you're going to beat me up because I'm more punk than you. And it was that kind of, I think that's the logic, is that that's the logic of the counter image of the comic that Jauss also identifies in his reception theory.
Interesting. There is a difference between self-mutilation and, you know, provoking a mutilation from someone else.
That's right.
You know,
That's right.
It's kind of an interesting way of explaining it.
Well, in that particular instance, you could say, you know, he didn't egg them on per se, but it had built up to that point. A biography was written a few years ago by his sister, Susanna Kippenberger. That's actually really quite good. And most people who knew him say it's, even though it's written by a family member, it's pretty direct, pretty unvarnished, and it just came out in English. Roberta Smith wrote a review of it in the Times, and she tells the story, and it's the idea is that it was headed in that direction, you know, so he did provoke them. But yeah, I see your point. Yeah, that is a contradiction. Oh yes.
Yeah, no, I was just wondering if he had any influence on Eastern artists. And this representational phase, like Neil Roth, and even later Matthias Walscher. I was just, because some of this, that sort of unusual sense of humor is in play, certainly in even some of Roth's paintings, which is
that's
not
a really
considered
interesting
conservative.
Point. Well, for one thing, so he was obviously alive for several years after the wall went down. He died in '97 though, and the whole New Leipzig school kind of comes into formation and gets known in the early 2000s, 2003 in particular, it's one of the first really major shows. So those students who could have potentially come into contact with him, I'm pretty sure didn't. They were more...
But through Sigma Pope, even, could you...
I think the thing is, a number of the people who studied in Leipzig, and that's really the place in the East that had the most thriving scene. Dresden and some other cities did as well, but Leipzig in particular. One, they were heavily influenced by Neo Rauch, who was not necessarily their teacher, but was 10 years older and had begun to study under the old Leipzig school, as it were, and their students in the 80s, so before the wall went down. And so Rauch was a huge influence, but so were people like Polka, so I'm sure Kippenberger was an influence, but I think not in the direct way that Rauch would have been. And I just want to say, and just to also say that a number of these students who studied at Leipzig and became known, David Schnell, Burkhaberle, Weichler, these people, and I can't remember right now where each of them is from, Tim Eitel, a good number of them are from the West. You know, they deliberately chose to go to Leipzig and study in a very traditional academy. And so it's hard to say. I think in many ways they were more influenced by the legacy of what was being painted in the 60s, 70s, and 80s in the East.
What would you say his legacy is then, or is there particularly for these?
Well, I think by now, you know, these divisions have disappeared in many respects. He's had different legacies. You know, he had direct contact with a number of artists in different ways. In the 80s and early 90s, he had several studio assistants, each of whom went on to become a well-known artist. Michael Kreber, for instance, who's gotten a lot of attention in the last 10 years. He's actually only a year younger than Kippenberger, but his work was really not shown consistently until the early 1990s, and in the States really only in the last 10 years or so. And he shows at Green Naftali in Chelsea, and you know, a painting of his appeared on the cover of Art Forum maybe about 5 years ago for the first time, and he was Kippenberger's studio assistant, and one of the stories about working for Kippenberger was that he stole all their ideas. They basically provided a lot of ideas for him, and he was completely upfront about that. So so Kreber, let's see, several other people, and some younger ones who were not particularly well known. Tobias Rehberger, I think, worked with him for a short time, and why am I blanking on his name? It's well known. Come up with it in a second. A well-known English artist. Name's slipping my mind. Who also went on to have a successful career. Who also made a lot of the work. So. Yeah.
Do you think you can place Kippenberger in any of the movements, the German movements of the 20th century, as a result? And how would you coin, how would you coin him in that context?
Yeah.
Because I found that, certainly there was an overwhelming amount of narcissism that, to me, was at the center of his work. So
I think I don't think there is one group that he would affiliate with. I think he tapped into some different traditions. Everything from expressionism. He certainly there's so many different styles he worked in, and he worked also in a series of paintings in the early 1980s in particular. I didn't get into that here. I deal with that elsewhere in the book. But so historical expressionism, but also the history of theater and cabaret. Karl Valentin was a major performer based in Munich in the teens and 20s, whose kind of slapstick performance, I think, was an influence on Kippenberger. The history of Dada German Dada would certainly be in there. He did a number of works dealing with collage and pasted paper works that he published as small books. In other words, he was really mining. There's a bit of a kind of archaeological approach to the history of modern art going back to the late 19th century and on. Other cultures as well, French, and you see other places that he made reference to, but a lot of it really has a kind of German sensibility, and German romanticism resonates in a lot of it as well. This kind of, ideas of whether it's the sublime or kind of love of nature, he sort of reversed that and turned it into a kind of identification with artifice, and even sort of, you could even say the sort of sublime of the artificial, being overwhelmed by mediation. A lot of what he and his peers were doing had a lot to do with getting their ideas from the daily paper. One critic at the time called it picture journalism, and in a lot of ways, his paintings at the time were simply reactions to what was happening right in front of him, and getting ideas from friends and anecdotes and all kinds of things. So I would not put him into one particular group. And as soon as you start putting him into something like neo-expressionism, the connections are certainly there. He was in the shows, so it does make sense historically, but I think one also needs to pull him out of that as well.
It seems like the type of humor that you keep referring to, the sort of maybe cynical humor that's kind of in play to make light of maybe heavier subjects.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to me like it's a pretty logical extension of Greek humor or dark humor.
Yeah.
I was just curious if you touch upon that in your book.
It's a good question. There was what happened, and what I think happens is people. This was my dissertation, and so as people turn dissertations into books, things happen. Things get put in and left out. And so one of the things that was in my dissertation that I ended up pushing away was dealing with the word irony and its history. And I'm not claiming that I do any justice to the ancient world's conception of irony, or even Enlightenment irony, but I did have moments in the dissertation where I get into that history a little bit, talk about the different resonances that this term had over the years. And what happened was, this dissertation began with the focus on irony as the way to link up these figures. And as I got into that, I realized it just was a word that was getting a bit tired because it was so much of a trope of postmodernism. And I started realizing that jokes and humor that's what I kept falling back on.
Yeah.
And so when I changed it, the dissertation was a bit longer, but I did some other things. I added an artist to the book who wasn't in the dissertation, and I radically altered a couple chapters, a couple didn't stay the same. went, or a couple stayed the same rather. It went through these different phases, but I did, partly under the advice of some of the external readers, this is also part of the process, is I pushed away a little bit from the more distant histories of these terms. And so the way I did it here, where I sort of situate, I talk about how the word Vince in German really has these two seemingly divergent meanings. That's about as far as I go. There are references throughout the book to older theories, to older moments. I have a little portion where I talk about Schlegel, but I do not in any way do justice to the history of tragedy and comedy. And it would be a good thing to pursue, but I had a page limit that I had to stick to, and it just would have. I also, I think, would have been one. I read into this a little bit, but I would feel a little bit like too much of a dilettante to have done that properly, because there's a great book that came out not that long ago, and I don't recall the title right now, about Greek laughter by a British historian. It's an enormous book, and I used that in my dissertation. It came out right as I was writing it. It must have come out in the early to mid 2000s, and it's unbelievable. If you're interested in the theory, I could eventually tell you what it is, but off the top of my head, I don't remember. It's so complex and rich that I decided not to try to compete.
Right.
You talked about your dissertation. A lot of art history students here are probably thinking about this big project. Could you please talk to us a little bit about the processes that you went through in order to materialize this project?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I mean, and I think it's good, because I work with PhD students now, and I haven't been at BU quite long enough to have seen anybody through defense. I've been on multiple defenses, but always as a second or third reader from other people's projects. So I learned a lot by the guidance of more senior first readers, which was great. And now I have 3 or 4 people who are sort of moving slowly into their dissertations, including one who, 2 now have had their perspective passed. And so one of the things we talk about is, are you making a dissertation or are you making something that will become a book? Because getting a book published now is so unbelievably complicated and competitive and difficult financially, much more so than it was a generation ago. The university presses have very little money. It's not uncommon that young authors, youngish authors, have to come up with some kind of subsidy to help publish the book. If you're lucky enough to have a job where, in my case, I was able to get some money from my university to cover my end costs, then it tends to work a little bit better. But the process was, in my case, it was a little unusual in that I got 2 grants to spend 2 years in Berlin. And so that's where I finished I did a lot of my research in New York with short trips to Germany. And then I was able to spend 2 years, the first 9 months to a year, I was finishing research, and then I was writing for a year. And then I got the job at BU before I finished. And so in my case, everything was much more rushed than I would have liked it to be. It was hectic. It wasn't ideal. I didn't have a moment to let the thing sit for a year or 2. I would have really liked that, and I think the project would have benefited from it, frankly. But I had to move quickly because of the whole 5 to 10 minute clock ticking and all of that. And so the process, just to keep it short, you essentially once you get a manuscript close to where you think it's, at least parts of it are ready to be read, you come up with a proposal. And what I did was I simply used the proposal, the structure of the proposal that MIT Press sends out if you ask for it, and it basically ended up becoming a 16-page single-space document with just endless amounts of information, marketing and books and competition and all kinds of questions. And it was very helpful as a template because it makes you think about what it is you're trying to do. So that was my first step. I sent it out to several places, and Chicago was interested. And then you start the process of submitting chunks of it. So the first chunk was the intro and 2 chapters, and that was sent to 3 readers, and that came back, and then I wrote the rest of it and sent it out again, and then went to 2 readers, and then I responded to their changes, and it went out one more time to 1 reader who read all 3 versions of it. And this is all over a 2-3 year period. And then the fun part happens where you have to deal with things like copyright permissions, the stuff that you don't think about while you're just trying to get a contract. And so once it was moving toward production, the production process can't start until you have all your permissions lined up. And that took a long time. And in my case, it's expensive. I mean, in a way, working with living artists was not a bad thing. A lot of, I now owe about 60 books, copies of my book, to various people as payment, because they said, sure, we'll give you an image for free, but you need to send us 2 copies of your book. And at the time, like, free sounds great, but of course now I have to buy, I get it free from my publishers, I have to buy them, basically. And so I'm trying to find money to do that right now. But, these things come up as you go along. It's kind of a grueling process, and then other things pop up, like Zygmunt Polka passed away in the summer of 2007, and I have, I think, 9 illustrations by him, and I hadn't gotten his permission before he died, and so that delayed my book by 6 months, because his estate didn't figure out how it was going to deal with permission issues for good reason for a long time. So that then really can delay the process, and then the production that goes through 7 phases. It's really fun, actually. I mean, it's
What do you enjoy?
exciting.
So
Yeah, I really did. It's not that I enjoy. It's funny because I think I've talked to a lot of people whose book because the first book, if it was your dissertation, is itself an unusual thing, because you've worked on it much longer than you will hopefully your second book, or who knows? It's been gestating for so long, and you're so over it by the time it comes out. So I really am happy with the object, and it's really, and I really appreciate the opportunity to put this out there into the public. But in a way, the writing itself has just gone over so many times that I'm more into just sort of holding it and not opening it. And I don't mean that in a silly way. I mean that it's just, that's kind of how I thought that would be. Yep. Could look at that for years. Yes.
I'm really interested in Sloterdijk's critique of cynical reason.
Yeah.
And from what I understand, it's sort of paints the gray area between affirmation and cynicism in a very tenuous political landscape.
Yeah.
And is the title meant to be ironic? Is it meant to be sort of self-referential to Kant and the whole ideological?
Yeah.
upheaval?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it is. And that is, so right in the title, you see that he's referring back to the Enlightenment. And so one of the things he's doing in the book, he himself he was something like 18 or 20, I think he was born in 48, if I remember right. So he was about 20 years old in 1968, so he is that generation. And he says himself that one of his motivations was to look at his peers, his own generation, and ask why so many of them had left behind activism and had either gone into businesses or simply just led normal lives. And he himself had been, I think, involved in politics, political activism for a while in the late 60s. And so it's kind of looking back to the Enlightenment in order to help them understand the 60s in some respect. And it's also a way of saying, how do we read Frankfurt School theory after what happens to the 1960s, so to speak, after this acknowledgement of these failures. And so he's referring a lot to Adorno and Horkheimer. Benjamin pops up in there a little bit. But he also has a whole, it's quite a large book. It's quite substantial. There's a whole final section, 200 or 300 pages on its own, that is a case study of all of his theories about the psychosomatic of the zeitgeist. In other words, about a lot of his discussion of cynicism takes place through analogies to the body. So he has whole chapters on the mouth, the eyes, the anus, parts of the body, and how each of them can induce laughter or can somehow be can deal with these questions of cynicism, of humor, of protest. And so it's all read through this kind of physical manifestation. So his writing, this chunk at the end is about how the Weimar period for him represents. And he himself wrote a dissertation or habilitation on Nietzsche, and so he's very grounded in Nietzschean philosophy. So there are all these currents of German political thought and philosophy running through this book. And so if you want to read the theory part's the first 2/3, and then there's a case study part on the Weimar Republic, and he really uses these tropes he comes up with in the first part to read that period as one in which protest in a period of apathy and in the wake of the First World War was quite effective, according to his reading. I don't know if that answers your question. question.
Yeah, and so is the goal epistemic in the sort of Kantian sense of like understanding the way that we understand all these things, or was it purely political and sort of understanding just the nuances in the political?
It's in Sloterdijk's case, it's much more social and political.
Okay.
It's more of a kind of sociocultural history than it is a work of philosophy. It's a very strange book, and the reviews at the time remarked on that it's not. He's trained as a philosopher, but it says something even today where he teaches is at an art school, an art media university in Karlsruhe. In other words, he works with media artists, he works with art historians training in there. He does not teach in a philosophy program.
But he is a cultural producer.
He is, yeah, and he's also a famous public figure now. He appears on television a lot, for instance, and he has a program. It's called the Four Philosophers, and he invites people on to talk about philosophy. So he can do that. It's just, and he does it in other books, more in the sense of philosophy as a mode of discourse. The book I'm referring to, Critique of Cynical Reason, is more interested in questions of social history, cultural history.
Well, thank you so much. That was really